Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. It was late November 1889. And the London fog appeared to creep up from the cobblestones, staining every window pane and winding around the gas lamps like a living creature. Baker Street, in its normal winter gloom, had a dismal aspect. But within the cosy walls of 221B, my companion Sherlock Holmes was unconcerned about the dreariness that pervaded the outside world. That particular morning, he sat cross-legged in his armchair, shrouded in his dressing robe, and silently studied cigar ash samples placed across a spread of Persian newspaper. His eyes, those sharp, hawk-like instruments of deduction, flickered between the samples with a zeal that had recently been lacking. The weeks had passed in relative monotony, with no case worthy of his tremendous faculties, and I was beginning to worry that his mental stagnation would drive him back to the old 7% solution. But for now he was pleased with his ash. I had just turned the second page of the Times when the doorbell rang below. Holmes didn't move. Step light tread. Silk rustles. Either a lady or a gentleman with considerable affectation, he whispered without looking up. Mrs. Hudson led the visitor in seconds later, revealing a young woman draped in a dove-grey travelling cloak, her face partially obscured by a netted veil. Her hands, gloved in soft beige kid, trembled as she moved further into the room. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice exact yet strained, "Sir Jasper Meacham recommended you to me. He claimed you were not a man to dismiss the unexplained." Holmes tilted his head. "Sir Jasper is generous in his praise. Pray and take a seat. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson." The woman gave me a faint nod, and then perched gently on the edge of the settee, clutching her handbag as if it contained something deadly or divine. "My name is Miss Evelina Mayfield," she announced. "Until a week ago, I was to marry Mr. Douglas Ashcombe of Warwickshire. But Mr. Holmes, he has died. His head was found smashed against a marble pedestal in his country house's conservatory. And now his solicitor has asked me to account for a clothing." Holmes leaned forward with great attention. "A dress, Miss Mayfield?" She opened her handbag and took out a neatly folded parcel, covered in brown paper. She pulled the string and unfolded the tissue, revealing a pale ivory gown that appeared to be satin. The hem and bodice were streaked with dark ash, as if they had been dragged across a dying hearth. "This was returned to my rooms at the Langham," she explained, carefully laying it on the table between us. No note or explanation. "But the ash matches what was discovered on Douglas's collar. The cops believe I wore it the night he died." Holmes did not touch the dress, instead inspecting it with narrowed eyes. "A worrying article. Was this your gown, Miss Mayfield?" "No, I have nothing like it. And yet it fits your measurements?" She paused. "Yes." Holmes gazed at me before returning his attention to the young woman. "The ashes. Was it identified?" "Birchwood, per the constable. There is a fire pit in the conservatory where Douglas was discovered, but no fire had been started that night." The ash was ancient. Holmes's fingers tapped the armrest of his chair. "And you were not in Warwickshire at the time of his death?" "I was in London, rehearsing for a recital. 6 people can attest to it. I hadn't seen Douglas for 3 days. He sent me a strange letter the night before he died, referring of things he remembered, but it was vague, even lyrical. I didn't think much of it till—" Her voice wavered. Holmes rose, took up a magnifying glass, and bent over the damaged garment. "Dr. Watson, if you please." I joined him as he carefully corrected the folds with the point of a quill. "Note, Watson," he remarked gently, "the ash is not uniform. There is birchwood, yes, but also traces of cigar ash, black and oily. And this—" He removed something barely visible from the seam near the hem. A shard of glass, pale violet. He turned back to Miss Mayfield. "Tell me, did Mr. Ashcombe smoke?" "Cigars, indeed. However, he favored Egyptian ones, thin, wrapped in gold paper. This is not an Egyptian cigar, most likely a Havana. And this glass, do you recognize it?" She scrutinized the shard, brow wrinkled. Yes. It resembles the stem of a perfume vial that I once gave him. He kept it on the mantelpiece in his study." "It was constructed of amethyst glass," Holmes nodded. as if a previously unnoticed puzzle piece had softly clicked into place. "Miss Mayfield," he began, returning to his chair and lacing his fingers together, "if what you say is true, then someone has gone to considerable lengths to implicate you in a crime, or at the very least, to frighten you from pursuing the truth. Do you think Mr. Ashcombe had enemies?" She paused. "His father died 2 years ago, leaving him the estate. His elder brother, Harold, was disinherited for reasons I was never told. They hadn't communicated for 5 years. However, there was something in Douglas's voice last week. He claimed he felt watched." "Interesting," Holmes remarked. "Did he name anyone?" "No." Holmes rose up abruptly and said, "We must leave to Warwickshire immediately. I assume the house is under police seal." "Yes, but I believe we can gain access." "Excellent. Watson, pack your stuff. We will take the afternoon train." Holmes studied Miss Mayfield with unusual attention as she rose to repack the ash-stained robe. When the door closed behind her, he turned to face me and continued, "A man is discovered with ash on his collar and glass beside his head, and a woman is sent in a clothing not her own, blackened with the same ash. This is no ordinary situation, Watson. Someone is building a stage, and we have just received an invitation to the performance." And then he struck a match and lighted a thin, dark Havana cigar. The train ride to Warwickshire was melancholy, despite the heated compartment and the repetitive clatter of the wheels under us. Holmes sat opposite me, his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together in that peculiar manner that always indicated deep and concentrated thought. I had brought over the most recent edition of The Strand, but I found myself simply flicking the pages without reading a single word. My thoughts, like his, was preoccupied with the peculiar subject of the ash-stained clothing. Miss Evelina Mayfield had joined us shortly at Paddington Station to deliver the letter she had received from the late Mr. Ashcombe, her pale face composed but plainly strained beneath her netted veil. Holmes had grabbed the envelope with only a cursory glance at its postmark, placing it in his inner pocket without unfolding it, as though its contents could provide greater insight later. When viewed in the correct context, by the time we arrived in Middle Wensford, the light was fading. The Ashcombe Estate's housekeeper had arranged for a hired brougham to meet us at the station, and we were soon rumbling along narrow lanes bordered with leafless hedgerows and damp, brooding fields. The countryside seemed stuck in hush, as if nature herself were holding her breath. It was soon after 5 p.m. when the first gabled peak of the Ashcombe home emerged from the fog. Ashcombe House was no pleasant manor. Its stone walls were the colour of aged bone, and its windows shone weakly through the mist. As we reached the front door bordered by twisted yew trees, Holmes leaned slightly toward me and murmured, "Look, Watson, the right turret window is darker than the others. I assume there has been recent smoke damage. Yet no fire has been reported." The butler, a tall, iron-spined man with parchment-coloured cheeks, introduced himself as Croft. His demeanour was firmly right, yet I saw a stiffness around the jaw that indicated discomfort. "You're Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. We have prepared the east guest rooms. The policeman, Mr. Ridley, left instructions that you were to be permitted full access. Dinner is scheduled for 7 p.m. The late Mr. Ashcombe's study and the conservatory have been undisturbed since the constable's last inspection." "Very good," Holmes said with a nod. "We'll begin in the study." Croft led us through frigid halls of stone and timber, the kind you imagine reverberating with the footsteps of a less forgiving century. The study was a long rectangular space filled with dark oak bookcases. At one end was a large hearth beneath a carved mantelpiece with the family crest, an ash tree encircled in a silver ring. The glass perfume bottle Miss Mayfield had indicated was smashed beside the hearth, the pieces brushed into a neat pile by what I believed was the constable's fingers. Holmes squatted alongside it, remaining silent. "Not broken by accident," he murmured. "Look here, fracture cleanly at the neck, not the base. It was shattered purposefully and violently." He retrieved a little packet from his breast pocket and took out a glass shard he had recovered from the dress earlier that day. He held it next to the pile and compared the colors. The same amethyst hue, consistent fracture pattern. This was the beginning. He next proceeded to the desk where a silver blotter, inkstand, and beautifully placed correspondence tray were undisturbed. "No signs of struggle," I remarked. "Moving ahead." "Quite. And yet we are to assume Mr. Ashcombe fell in the conservatory with such force that his skull struck the marble." Why come via here first, unless—" He turned and walked quickly to the next door, which opened into a narrow passageway leading to the conservatory. It was a vaulted room made of glass and wrought iron, with pale failing light and the aroma of moist earth. The air still had a faint scent of smoke. The fire pit stood at the far end, its base surrounded in grey ash, despite the fact that no fire was kindled. A modest marble pedestal sat in the centre of the room, between two potted palms. Blood stained the edges, and a slight brown smear damaged the tiles beyond. Holmes knelt by the pedestal and smelt the air intensely. "Strange," he said. "You notice anything, Watson?" "Only that it's colder in here than elsewhere." "Not quite. There is a fragrance reminiscent of burning oil. And look, more cigar ash, different from the one on the dress. The ash here is pale grey with a finer texture. A separate smoker, possibly in a separate room altogether." He stood and walked slowly around the pedestal. The position of the blood implies that he fell forward, but from which direction? There are no scuff marks. There are no evidence of a battle. Despite that, at that point a quiet rumbling behind us stopped Holmes's thoughts. A woman stood in the doorway, possibly in her late 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled tightly back and eyes that had seen too much and offered too little. "I beg your pardon," she replied. "I did not want to startle you." "I'm Mrs. Griggs, housekeeper." Holmes bowed slightly. "We appreciate your hospitality. Could I bother you with a few questions?" She nodded, but her lips thinned. "To your knowledge, did Mr. Ashcombe entertain visitors in the days leading to his death?" "Sir, he rarely had company. Not since Mr. Harold was kicked out. There was only one guest, a male who arrived last Monday and remained the night. I did not see his face. He went before morning. Name?" "He did not give one. Mr. Ashcombe only mentioned that he was an old school friend. But he appeared unsettled afterward." "In what way?" "Restless, distracted. He requested that I remove the portrait of his father from the study mantel. That was very unlike him." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Was that done before or after the vial was broken?" "The following morning. But I never got to it." "And the dress, was it seen in the house?" She hesitated, glancing between us. "I cannot say, but I found a loose thread caught on the latch of the conservatory door. Ivory satin, I believe. I meant to mention it to the constable, but the whole affair was already such a sorrow." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, note that carefully. A thread in the conservatory, glass in the study, ash in both. But all details choreographed to implicate Miss Mayfield. The thread might well have been sewn there after the fact." As Mrs. Griggs withdrew, Holmes looked out through the misty glass wall of the conservatory. His brow furrowed. "This house is a theatre," he said quietly. "Someone has arranged their stage with the precision of a dramatist. The ash, the glass, the dress, it is not a matter of impulse but of rehearsal. Someone is playing a part." At dinner, Holmes scarcely touched his food. He spent most of the meal pacing the corridor beyond the dining room, occasionally muttering to himself. I took the opportunity to review the letter Miss Mayfield had given us. It was written in a loose, urgent scrawl. "Evelina, I see now what I refused to see for years. The shadows here are older than I feared. I must speak to you, but not in London. There is someone watching. If you receive anything from this house that you did not request, destroy it. I will write again after the 18th. Yours, D. Holmes." Read the letter over my shoulder. He feared exposure, possibly blackmail. And note, the warning came too late. She received the dress on the 20th. He was already dead. Just then, Croft appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Holmes, a telegram has arrived for you." Holmes tore it open and read silently. Then, without a word, he turned and strode for his coat. "Watson, we leave for the village in 10 minutes. The constable has detained a man attempting to sell a woman's dress, stained with ash. It appears our ghost has grown clumsy, and with that we vanished into the fog once more. The fog in the village clung to the gas lamps like a shroud, casting each pool of light into an island adrift in obscurity. The road from Ashcombe House to the constabulary station was narrow and uneven, and the carriage wheels groaned in protest as we approached the square. Holmes leaned forward in his seat, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The telegram folded in his hand as if it were a ciphered map rather than a mere message. We were met at the small brick station by Constable Ridley, a stocky man with close-set eyes, and the permanent squint of one who mistrusts both people and weather. He led us without ceremony through the front door and into a modest back chamber, where a single oil lamp cast flickering shadows across a desk piled with worn ledgers. Seated on a wooden chair with his hands cuffed behind him was a man of indeterminate age, perhaps 35, though hardship had carved deeper lines into his face. His jacket was too fine for a common labourer, but it hung on him loosely, as though it had belonged to a better-fed past. A bruise had begun to flower under one eye, and he glared at us with the surly defensiveness of the cornered. "Name's Lionel Keane," Ridley said, nudging a folded gown atop the desk with the end of his truncheon. "Caught him trying to sell this to the pawnbroker just after dark. Woman's dress. Same colour and style as the one you were asking after, Mr. Holmes." Holmes lifted the garment with a gloved hand. At first glance, it appeared nearly identical to the gown Miss Mayfield had received. Ivory satin, delicately embroidered along the bodice, but this one bore even more pronounced ash staining along the hem and sleeves. A faint scent clung to it, not merely smoke, but something more acrid. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Two dresses, identical in make, similarly marked with ash. And yet Miss Mayfield claims to own neither." Keane gave a snort. "Never said it was hers. Found it in the hedgerow off Calder Lane near the edge of the estate. A strange place to misplace a dress," Holmes said coolly. "You found it and thought to profit by pawning it. That is your claim?" The man's jaw twitched. "Didn't think anyone would miss it. Just looked like laundry someone had tossed away. And yet you attempted to sell it under a false name, did you not?" Keane said nothing. Holmes turned to Ridley. "Has he been searched?" The constable nodded and reached into a side drawer, producing a small box. These were in his pocket. Holmes sifted through the contents. A crumpled calling card bearing the name Harold Ashcombe, a broken cufflink with the Ashcombe crest, and a folded note with half a sentence scrawled in pencil. "Must be returned before she sees it again." "Ah," Holmes said softly. "The curtain begins to lift." He rounded on Keane. "You knew Mr. Harold Ashcombe." "Don't know who that is," Keane muttered. "Then you stole from him." No response. Holmes stepped forward, his voice dropping a pitch. "Let us not waste time. You are no mere thief of opportunity. You were sent to remove this dress from somewhere it ought not have been. You were either too late or too nervous to destroy it, and instead thought to turn it into coin. The note, before she sees it again, refers, I believe, to Miss Mayfield. So I ask you plainly, was the dress ever inside Ashcombe House?" Keane's eyes flicked to Ridley, then back to Holmes. A flicker of calculation passed over his face. "I ain't saying nothing more without a barrister." Holmes studied him in silence for a moment, then turned to Ridley. "He will be more valuable to us outside of this room than in it. I recommend you hold him overnight and release him tomorrow, quietly." Ridley frowned. "Let him go? After this?" "He will lead us somewhere. I intend to follow." Back at the Ashcombe estate, Holmes returned to the conservatory with renewed purpose. Though it was near midnight, he moved through the rooms with the fervour of one who had glimpsed the outline of a buried truth. I watched as he examined the hinges on the outer door, which opened onto a frost-hardened garden path that led to the perimeter wall. "This is where our man entered," he said, "and likely where something was taken or planted." He stepped outside into the cold night air, his lantern sweeping low. I followed as he crouched near the edge of the hedgerow. "Watson, do you see this?" A path of crushed grass and disturbed dirt stretched from the conservatory door to a small crack in the wall. Although the marks were faint, their direction was clear. "Someone came this way," I announced. "More than once," Holmes answered. "Observe the variation in pressure. Some steps are deep while others are shallow. And here, what do you think of this?" He pointed to a patch of soot at the base of the wall. A fragment of burnt fabric lay embedded within it, barely visible. Holmes removed it with tweezers and held it to the lantern. "Part of a glove," he mumbled. "Woolen, singed. Someone handled the burning material here." Back inside, Holmes paced in front of the fireplace in the study, while I sought to organize the chaos. "We now have two garments," I explained, "both soiled with ash, one for Miss Mayfield and the other abandoned. A man caught attempting to dispose of the second, carrying a message addressed to Harold Ashcombe, and a trail of someone crossing the grounds at night." "But to what end?" Holmes turned, eyes gleaming. "Consider the motivation, Watson. Miss Mayfield was to receive nothing from Douglas Ashcombe until the marriage was finalized. If she was discredited or accused of being implicated in his death, the union would be null and invalid, and the estate's future would be unknown. Unless, I explained slowly. The estate reverted to someone else. Precisely. Harold Ashcombe, the disinherited brother. Why was he disinherited? What if Douglas discovered something? An old crime, a deceit, or a counterfeit signature? Something that prompted him to cut Harold off. And that same secret, when threatened with exposure, became motive enough for murder. Holmes nodded. It suits. However, it remains unverified. He went to the writing desk and got the blotter. He held it up to the lamplight and examined the pressed impressions. Bring me a pencil, Watson. I offered him one, and he slowly rubbed it against the paper, showing a thin outline of writing. Must destroy it before the recital. She cannot see it. Too dangerous. He sat back. We must speak to Mrs. Griggs at once. The housekeeper, woken from her room, entered wrapped in a shawl, her face tired but alert. Mrs. Griggs, Holmes inquired, do you recall what Mr. Ashcombe was writing the morning of his death? She shakes her head. Only that he asked me to have one of the footmen bring down a trunk from the attic. He claimed it held something from his mother's estate, papers, I believe. Was the trunk ever opened? No, sir. It was restored to the attic that very afternoon. Holmes turned to me. Watson, we have a destination. 10 minutes later, with lamp in hand, we climbed the tiny upstairs staircase. The atmosphere was dense with dust and quiet. Among the ancient furniture and packed photos was a tall cedar box with rusty metal hinges. Holmes knelt to examine the latch. Unforced, he replied. But this... Watson, look. A journal was found within the chest beneath a sheaf of yellowed letters and mildewed lace. The cover bore the initials. H.A. Holmes opened it and began reading. After a few pages, he breathed. This is it, Watson. Proof of a deception, forged paperwork, altered dates. Financial records were doctored to conceal theft. Harold Ashcombe had been draining the family's finances for years before Douglas uncovered the truth. He snapped the journal closed. The motive is no longer a shadow. It has weight. It contains ink, and tomorrow it will have a name. He stood, his eyes filled with fire. But first let us see where Lionel Keene goes when he thinks no one is watching. The next morning was dark and cold, with clouds so low that they appeared to skim the chimney pots of Middle Wensford. As I climbed the stairs from our guest chambers at Ashcombe House, Holmes, already clothed and having his last cup of tea by the hearth, turned to face me. Keene will be released within an hour, he stated calmly, stroking the sleeve of his coat. Our carriage is waiting. You intend to follow him? I intend, he said, his eyes piercing, to study a man who believes the trail has gone cold. Such men are typically negligent with their steps when they think no one is watching. We boarded the same brougham that had taken us from the station, directing the driver to remain a safe distance once Keene had left. Holmes, his collar pushed up against the wind, kept one gloved hand inside his coat pocket, which held a small handgun and a notebook alongside his watch chain. He tapped his fingers on the ivory handle of the cane between his legs. Keene appeared just before 9. He didn't look around. His gait was neither hurried nor relaxed. Calculated, I thought, as if he was trying not to appear intent. Holmes gave our driver a slight nod, and the carriage rolled ahead slowly. Keene proceeded east through the hamlet, past shuttered stores and a row of modest stone homes, before turning down a smaller way to the edge of the woods beyond the old canal. We dismounted where the road became too rutted for the carriage and followed him on foot along the hedgerow. After about 15 minutes, Keene took a dirt path that led to a derelict gamekeeper's cottage, which was half swallowed by ivy and neglect. He looked around briefly. Holmes and I dropped low before pushing the door open and disappearing inside. Holmes squatted against a tree stump, his gaze fixated on the cottage. He's not alone, he muttered. Note the fresh prints. 2 sets, one smaller than the other, leading in. The door was unlocked. This implies that the occupant was expecting him. We sat in the cold for about 20 minutes, watching thin smoke curl from the crooked chimney. Finally, Holmes stood and dusted his hands. We've given them time enough to feel secure. The front door creaked as Holmes knocked. There was a rustle within, a low whisper, and suddenly the door opened an inch. A man's face came through the crack, but before he could speak, Holmes inserted the toe of his boot into the frame. I would advise against closing it, he stated calmly. You'll find I've a mind to speak with Harold Ashcombe before the wind changes. The door froze and then slowly opened. Inside stood a man, possibly 40 years old, tall, with a once refined bearing now draped in ragged clothes, and a trimmed beard that couldn't hide the tense quiver in his jaw. "You've got no right," he said, but Holmes raised his hand. "I have every right. Your sibling has died. Your name has come up twice in connection with evidence discovered in both London and Warwickshire. And you are hiding a man who tried to dispose of that evidence." Keane stood behind him beside a soot-darkened hearth, clutching a mug and staring at the ground. Holmes walked into the room. "I don't need a confession, just your companionship on the trip back to the constable's station. However, if you like a more formal arrest—" "Wait," Harold whispered, his voice low. "You think I murdered Douglas?" "I think," Holmes said, "that your hands are too clean for a man this deep in ash." "That is always telling." Harold's shoulders slumped. "I didn't kill him," he mumbled. "I was present, yes. I came back because he emailed me. Said he'd uncovered something in Father's ledgers. Something about inheritance." "Did you bring the dress?" Holmes asked. Harold blinked. "What now? Why would I—" Holmes turned to Keane. "Then you did." Keane looked up sharply. "I was told to. A man paid me. Said to leave it in Miss Mayfield's room and walk away." "What man?" "I don't know. He didn't offer a name. He wore a dark overcoat with a scarf pulled up to his nose. Give me the dress, the parcel string, the note, everything." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And he gave you a second dress?" Keane hesitated. "No, that one I discovered later. I thought it was the same. I figured it might still be worth something." Holmes turned back to Harold. "Assume for a moment that you are telling the truth. Why conceal your return to Ashcombe House?" "Because I feared what it looked like," Harold exclaimed. "He died the next morning, and I knew the family would jump at the opportunity to blame me." Holmes pondered this before reaching into his coat and withdrawing the journal. "Did you write this?" Harold's eyes expanded. "Where did you find that?" "In the attic, left with your mother's belongings." "It was conveniently forgotten." "It wasn't forgotten," Harold stated coldly. "Doug stole it. He stated he wanted to know why Father had cut me off. I told him it would only cause problems." "It caused his murder," Holmes remarked gently. Harold stared at him. "But I didn't kill him, so who had access to this journal? Who knew it existed?" Harold furrowed his brow. "Just me and Douglas. Perhaps Evelina. He told her almost everything." Holmes turned to face the hearth, staring into the dying embers. "No," he muttered, "not Evelina. But someone was close enough to overhear. Someone remained in the house." He spun on his heels. "Watson, we must return. I know who put together the dress, the ash, and the illusion of guilt." Within an hour, we were back at Ashcombe House. Holmes walked straight to the servants' quarters, where Mrs. Griggs was mending linen before a tiny coal fire. He stared at her for a long time before speaking. "You were his nurse, right?" "Not just the housekeeper." She raised her eyes. "From the time he was a child. You loved him." "Yes. But you loved the family more," Holmes added softly. "And that is why you killed him." The needle remained still in her hand. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. Holmes sat across from her. He found the journal and told you that he intended to show it to the family solicitors. It would destroy Harold, and Harold, you felt, still deserved the estate. Tears filled her eyes. He was not cruel. He was weak. He made mistakes. But he was still an Ashcombe. "So you drugged Douglas," Holmes continued. "Perhaps something in his brandy. You intended to frighten him. Perhaps lock the study, burn the journal. But he awoke too soon." She said nothing. "You struck him," Holmes said. "And when he collapsed, you staged the scene to implicate Miss Mayfield. You dressed a dummy in the gown, dragged it through the ashes, shattered the vial, then later had Keane deliver the dress to her room, so that if anyone traced it, it would lead to Evelina." "And the second dress?" "I kept it too long. I was going to burn it. But Keane stole it from the laundry when he came for wages. And the letter?" I asked. She looked down. "Douglas wrote it to Evelina. I found it in the blotter." I hoped it would never be read. Holmes stood slowly. "Constable Ridley will need your statement." As she was led away, I turned to Holmes. "You knew before we left the village?" "I knew," he said quietly, "when I saw the ash smudged into the rug beneath the perfume vial. The pattern was brushed inward, not outward, dragged deliberately toward the center. A theatrical gesture." He walked to the window and stared out at the garden. "Love, Watson," he said after a moment. "Love misplaced is the most dangerous motive of all." The quiet that settled over Ashcombe House in the hours following Mrs. Griggs' arrest was of a different sort. Not the heavy, expectant silence that had haunted the halls before, but one laced with resignation, like the stillness that comes after a storm has passed and left the landscape changed. Holmes and I returned to the drawing room, where the early afternoon light spilled through the tall windows, illuminating the motes of dust suspended in the air like floating evidence of all that had transpired. Holmes sat once more before the cold hearth, his fingers steepled, his gaze directed not outward but inward. I knew this mood well. Though we had uncovered the immediate mechanism of the crime, Holmes's mind remained restless, still turning the screws of the case in search of a final click of certainty. "Something troubles you," I said quietly. He nodded once. The confession was convenient. Too convenient. And yet the details she gave were not inaccurate, only incomplete. "You believe she was not alone in the act?" "I believe," he said, rising, "that Mrs. Griggs did not strike the blow that killed Douglas Ashcombe." I was about to press him for more when Croft appeared in the doorway. His expression neutral but taut. "Mr. Holmes, a gentleman has arrived, says he must speak with you urgently." "He's in the blue parlour." Holmes turned without a word, and I followed. The man awaiting us was a wiry figure in a grey coat, his dark moustache meticulously trimmed, his hands clasped before him like someone bracing for judgment. He stood as we entered and offered a curt bow. "My name is Leopold Gibbons. I was employed by Mr. Harold Ashcombe as a clerk and legal assistant." Holmes studied him with quiet intensity. "And why have you come to me now, Mr. Gibbons?" The man hesitated, then pulled a folded document from his breast pocket. "Because I cannot in good conscience withhold this any longer. Mr. Harold asked me last week to draw up an unsigned deed, an amendment to the inheritance arrangement of Ashcombe House. It would transfer all rights and authority back to him should Mr. Douglas Ashcombe die. The unmarried." Holmes took the document and read it carefully. I caught a glimpse of the phrasing. "The undersigned hereby relinquishes," but it bore no signature and no seal. When was this created? Holmes asked. 3 days before Mr. Douglas died. "Did you see Harold again after that?" "Yes. He said the deed would not be necessary, that Douglas had come to his senses. But I don't believe that anymore. I heard of Mrs. Griggs's arrest this morning, and I believe she is being used." Holmes gave a short nod and turned toward me. "Watson, retrieve the journal." I fetched it from his bag and placed it on the table. Holmes laid the unsigned deed beside it. 2 pieces of the same clockwork. One, a record of fraud. The other, a means to erase its consequences, and both connected to Harold Ashcombe. He turned back to Gibbons. "You did well to come forward. But tell me, did Harold mention anything about his brother's letter to Miss Mayfield?" Gibbons looked puzzled. "He mentioned a letter, yes. Said it was rambling nonsense. He laughed about it, said it was written in a fit of melodrama." Holmes's face darkened, and he tapped the deed with his fingertip. "Melodrama, Watson, is often a veil for instinct. Douglas suspected something. He feared exposure. He tried to protect Miss Mayfield with a warning, but it came too late. There was a knock and Croft appeared once more. 'Miss Mayfield has arrived. She insists on seeing you both.'" Holmes immediately straightened, smoothing his coat. "Show her in." Evelina Mayfield entered as she had that first day, composed but pale, her eyes reflecting a weariness that ran deeper than mere sleeplessness. She sat without prompting and looked between us. "I heard about Mrs. Griggs," she said softly, "but something is wrong. That dress, the first one, was not just a threat. It was a message." Holmes tilted his head. "Explain." "I saw it again," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Yesterday, before I came here. I hadn't told anyone this, I was afraid. But when I left my rehearsal in London, someone was following me. A man in a grey overcoat. I lost him near Oxford Street. When I reached my apartment, the dress had been moved. Not opened, just moved. As though someone wanted me to know they'd been inside." Holmes's eyes became sharper. "You're sure it wasn't the police?" "No." I confirmed with the officer who had taken the item. He claimed it had never been retrieved. Holmes went to the window and remained silent for a long time. "It was not a warning," he answered finally. "There was surveillance. Someone planted the clothing to see how you'd react, to see whether you would flee or confess, and when you didn't respond, they tried again." He turned abruptly. "Watson, we must speak with Harold. Now." We found Harold Ashcombe in the morning room, pacing in front of the fire with restless intensity. He turned as we arrived, but the arrogance he wore the day before was vanished. In its stead was something hollow. Holmes didn't waste any time. Your clerk, Mr. Gibbons, has provided us with a document you instructed him to prepare. A deed that transfers ownership of Ashcombe House. Harold gulped. It was never signed. But it was prepared, Holmes remarked calmly. Upon your desire. You were aiming to hedge your return, laying the framework for inheritance. And you knew Douglas wouldn't sign it willingly. I didn't kill him. No, but you persuaded someone else that they must. Harold's gaze raced to the window. Mrs. Griggs was loyal to you. Holmes said, you utilized that loyalty. You told her that Douglas had discovered the journal. It would wreck everything. Evelina would hand it over to the press. You painted a threat and she, loving you as much as she loved this house, reacted. I never asked her to kill him, Harold murmured. You didn't have to, Holmes replied. You gave her the motive. She provided the deed, the clothing, and the drama. While you watched from the sidelines, Holmes moved closer. When she confessed, you said nothing. You let her carry everything. Harold's expression cracked just little. He lowers his head. I didn't want to lose everything, he added quietly. Then you should not have wagered everything, Holmes said. Outside, the first snowfall of the season had begun, with thin flakes rolling down the stone walkways like ash. Later that afternoon, as we sat again in the railway carriage bound for London, Evelina Mayfield across from us and Holmes staring out at the white blurred fields. I broke the silence. Do you think he will be charged? Eventually, Holmes said. There was no blood on his hands, yet he poured the wine, lighted the match, and shut the door. If the law cannot find him guilty, history will. Evelina remained still, her gaze fixated on the middle distance, and her hands clutched around the letter Holmes had handed to her. Douglas's final half-poetic warnings had taken on new meaning now. When we arrived at Paddington Station, Holmes sprang up and offered her a hand. You were never the intended victim, he explained calmly, but you were the measure of their guilt, and with that, we stepped back into the grey London fog. The streets of London greeted us with the typical muted sound of hooves and distant bells, their rhythm muffled by the setting snow. The frost had covered the rooftops in white, but Holmes didn't mind as we stepped off the train and into a waiting hansom cab. Miss Mayfield insisted on returning to her apartments alone, and Holmes unusually offered no objections. His gaze was drawn within, not to her departure or the hustle and bustle of the station, but to some unseen thought that had yet to fully unfold. He stayed silent throughout our ride into Marylebone, his brow wrinkled as if he were sorting through the vestiges of a dream. He only spoke again when we turned onto Baker Street, his voice low and meditative. Watson, when a puzzle fits together too cleanly, one must examine the shape of the pieces. You doubt Mrs. Griggs' confession. I do not doubt she acted, he said, slowly removing his gloves. But I doubt she acted first. We arrived at 221B and climbed the stairs, the familiar fragrance of pipe smoke and old papers welcoming us as if we were old friends. Mrs. Hudson had left a note on the mantel. 2 visitors had called while we were away, one with no name and the other just identifying himself as Mr. Jerome of the Piccadilly Press. Holmes read it, grimaced, and then moved to his desk, where he took out the small bundle we had retrieved from the conservatory, the singed woolen glove, the charred strip of satin, and the sliver of amethyst glass. He placed them side by side, like artifacts on an altar. Tell me, Watson, he replied, do you recall the scent that clung to the second dress, the one Keene tried to pawn? Something acrid, not just smoke. So I assumed it was a byproduct of ash. Creosote, Holmes replied softly. Not from a fireplace or a cigar, but from lamp oil, the type used in railroad lanterns. Industrial, cheap, pungent, and not kept anywhere in Ashcombe House. I felt a sudden shift in the air. You believe the second dress was never in the house. I believe it never saw a hearth at all. But I believe it was made to look as though it had. Which brings us, Watson, to the man in the grey overcoat, the one who paid Keene? Holmes nodded. And the same man who followed Miss Mayfield in London, who moved the parcel in her apartment, who knew enough to keep pressure on her nerves without ever revealing himself. There is someone still in play, someone who never showed his face at Ashcombe House, but who orchestrated the illusion with skill. You suspect Gibbons? Possibly, Holmes said, but Gibbons is a tool, a facilitator. The mind behind this play is more elusive. He turned abruptly and opened the drawer where he kept his index of London's less savoury citizens. cutthroats, blackmailers, and men who had never quite been caught. After flipping through 3 cards, he paused, withdrew a single yellowing entry, and laid it on the desk. Samuel Rourke, he read. Alias Rhodes. Former stagehand turned confidence man. Master forger, known for his skill in staging accidents and faked scenes for insurance claims. What connects him to this case? Holmes tapped the glass shard. Amethyst is not a common glass. Decorative, expensive, often imported. Rourke used it in a previous job 5 years ago. Forged a murder scene with sharded perfume bottles, a staged struggle, and a letter planted to cast suspicion elsewhere. The case was buried quietly. Wealthy family, embarrassed patrons, but I remember it well. He turned and reached for his coat again. Come, Watson, we are not done. If my suspicion is correct, Rourke is no longer in the country. But someone paid him, someone who remains nearby. And I intend to find out who gave the order. Night had fallen once more by the time we reached Piccadilly, where Holmes directed us down a narrow passage beside a tobacconist's. At the far end was a door that led to an office above a printer's shop, cramped, ink-stained and lit by 2 failing gas jets. Inside sat a man with spectacles perched halfway down his nose, and the unmistakable air of one who survived by knowing things before others did. Mr. Jerome, Holmes said smoothly. You left your card at my rooms. I did, yes, the man replied, rising. I hope to speak with you about Ashcombe House. Holmes remained standing. Speak then. Jerome swallowed, suddenly cautious. I was told unofficially that a journal was recovered from the Ashcombe estate. One implicating Harold in some manner. I was approached last week by a man offering me a sum to suppress anything that might emerge. I declined. Described the man, late 30s, scar over the right brow. Spoke with an East End accent, though he tried to hide it. Holmes nodded grimly. Rourke, he's resurfaced then. Jerome tilted his head. You know him? Only by reputation. He didn't come to silence the press. He came to test the waters. To see if the news had reached beyond the gates. That suggests he's worried. And men like Rourke don't worry unless the one paying them has vanished. We returned to Baker Street near midnight, the fog thicker now, choking the lamps and silencing the streets. Holmes threw his coat aside and immediately crossed to the fireplace, where he stood for several minutes in silence. I waited. At last he spoke. There was a third party, Watson. Someone who gave the order, who hired Rourke, who manipulated Mrs. Griggs, who ensured that neither Harold nor Evelina would inherit cleanly. Someone with knowledge of the journal's contents and of the timing of the will. But who? We've accounted for everyone close to the estate. Have we? He crossed to his desk and took out the letter Douglas had written to Miss Mayfield, which was half poetry and half terror. Read it again, he instructed. Specifically, the shadows here are older than I anticipated. That's not a metaphor, that's family, history. He opened the Ashcombe estate ledger, which we had briefly glanced over in the attic, forgotten among the trunks and lace. He flipped over the first few pages, pointing to a name, Geoffrey Ashcombe, an uncle, declared unsuitable in 1875, removed from the line of succession due to mental illness. However, they were never completely disinherited. His annuity continued. Surely he's long dead. Not according to the ledger, Holmes responded. There was a payment listed last quarter. To a private address in Devon. He paused. Who handles the annuity? Who has access to these accounts? Gibbons, I replied hesitantly. Holmes looked at me. Exactly. In the calm that followed, the wind outside seized the window pane and rocked it softly, like a knock from something long forgotten. Holmes refocused his attention on the flames after lighting his pipe. I suppose we have one final adventure to complete, Watson, to Devon, and to the last man, who may understand why a house full of ghosts continues to cast a shadow long after its heir has passed away. The journey to Devon. The next morning was made under a pale and drowsy sky, with the landscape transitioning from London's sooty facades to vast fields gently awakening beneath the frost. Holmes had been unusually quiet since our departure, with the leather-bound estate ledger sitting on his lap like a sacred book. He studied it with such concentration that I refrained from interfering, despite the fact that my mind was racing with inquiries of my own. He finally talked as we travelled through the short country lanes surrounded by bare-limbed elms. You may recall, Watson, the mention of a man named Geoffrey Ashcombe in the early records. declared unfit for society but never completely expunged from the estate's annals. He was born in 1826, 17 years before Douglas's father, the only brother of the senior Ashcombe and, until his seclusion, heir apparent. "I remember," I replied. "Committed, if I'm not mistaken, following a collapse in public." "Correct." The family kept quiet and handled the situation delicately. What stands out to me is that the annuity was not discontinued, quietly, consistently, and the signature certifying receipt changed, first from Geoffrey's hand to an unknown agent, then, shortly after his father's death, to one Mr. L. Gibbons. I sat up straighter. So Gibbons was not only Harold's clerk, but the handler of this annuity. Precisely. And in that capacity, he had access to all of the documents Harold had been denied, possibly even more. He knew about the journal. He was aware of the inheritance structures, and he would know better than anyone else when Douglas Ashcombe's death would reopen the succession line. "Then you believe Gibbons acted not as a servant, but as a beneficiary?" Holmes offered a slight smile. "A servant who has spent long enough in the shadow of masters may begin to see himself as one." The train dropped us in the peaceful village of Langridge, where we hired a trap to take us 2 miles beyond, to a wind-worn home identified simply as Willow Marsh Cottage. The address matched that of the annuity's recipient. It was a modest house set back from the path, more careworn than abandoned, with shuttered windows and a light smoke coming from the chimney. Holmes knocked with his cane 3 times. A woman in her 50s opened the door, simple yet immaculate, her hair twisted back tightly. She looked at us for a moment before stepping away silently. The sitting room into which we were led showed signs of discomfort: old books, worn carpets, and a small fire struggling against the morning chill. A man of unknown age sat by the hearth. His hair, though thinning, remained dark, and his eyes had the fixed focus of someone no longer fully anchored in the present. He glanced up at our entry but did not rise. "Mr. Geoffrey Ashcombe?" Holmes asked. The man gave a quick, unintentional chuckle. "I haven't been called that in decades. We are here on the matter of your nephew, Douglas Ashcombe." The old man blinked and turned towards the fire. "The boy's dead, isn't he?" "He is. I listened." The breeze informed me. Said that something had finally broken. He looked over his shoulder. "You're not the first to come asking." Holmes moved closer. "Who came before us?" A slim man holding a ledger. "Hair like coal dust. I wrote everything down. Said I was due something. Then he departed." "But he knew." Holmes gazed at me. "Gibbons, did he mention your brother's will, or your own position inside the estate?" "He spoke of ghosts," Geoffrey replied softly. "He said they were returning." The woman, who had been standing silently near the doorway, cleared her throat. "I forgive him. He has moments of clarity, but they are few. I am his nurse." Miss Celia March, Holmes bent. "May I see the ledger he signed?" She hesitated before crossing the room to a writing desk and retrieving a locked tin box. She pulled out many folded and yellowed papers from within. Holmes examined them rapidly. "This signature," he muttered. "It changes. Look, Watson, 2 years ago it was clear, if shaky. Then it suddenly becomes uniform, mechanical, forged." He looked up to the nurse. "When did Mr. Ashcombe stop writing for himself?" She appeared pained. "It was 3 years ago. I continued to sign in his name so as not to interrupt the annuity. So Gibbons never confirmed the man's condition. No. He paid with cash and departed fast. He did not ask any questions, yet he used your patient's name to claim funds. Funds he may have known could redirect the estate's power if Harold and Douglas both were removed." A moment passed in stillness. Holmes returned his attention to Geoffrey, who was now rocking slightly in his chair. "Did Gibbons ever discuss your claim? Your right as eldest male?" "I was promised nothing," the old man muttered. "The house washed over me like a river. They closed the gate. But he claimed it could be undone, that they'd fall like cards. If only—" His voice trailed off. Outside, the wind had increased up, blowing against the glass like fingers attempting to enter. Holmes straightened. "We've seen enough." We left the nurse and returned to the lane. After we were out of earshot, I turned to Holmes. "He's not capable of orchestrating anything." "No," Holmes agrees, "but he's the key." Gibbons used his identity or legal presence as an anchor. If Harold died and Douglas remained unmarried, the inheritance could go to the eldest living Ashcombe, Geoffrey. However, in his state, The estate would need to be managed through guardianship. Gibbons, Holmes nodded. A guardian who has entire power over the property, funds and titles, all in the name of a man who is too broken to recognize it. Gibbons played a long game. He fueled Harold's ambitions, kept the journal hidden, engineered the documents, and hired Rourke to create the illusion. But as the pieces started falling out of place, Douglas reaching out to Miss Mayfield, the journal reappearing, he panicked. He sent the dress, the ashes, the message. When that didn't work, he restaged the scene. He used Mrs. Griggs as a scapegoat, knowing that her loyalty would make her credible. And now? Now, Holmes said, stepping into the trap and motioning for me to follow, we'll return to London. And we call on Mr. Gibbons one more time, not as a clerk, but as the man who attempted to inherit an estate through shadows. As the trap's wheels turned once more towards Langridge Station, I noticed Holmes look down at his hand. In it he held a tiny strip of violet glass, the final piece, I realized, of a puzzle that had disguised itself as grief, donned the clothes of inheritance, and attempted to conceal its truth beneath satin and ash. The return journey to London was characterized by such absolute silence that even the usual clatter of the rails seemed muffled beneath its weight. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, one arm braced on the sill, the other curled beneath his chin in such complete stillness that I suspected he was going over the past week in order, testing for fault lines and tremors beneath the surface. I didn't disturb him. My thoughts churned steadily. The strands were coming together now, forged documents, stained dresses, and an elderly man in Devon whose signature had been weaponized without his knowledge. And at the center of it all was Leopold Gibbons, the quiet clerk, the cautious observer, the man who seemed to vanish when the light turned on him. When we stepped off the train at Paddington, Holmes moved with quick precision. He immediately hails a cab, and as we settle into our seats, he gives the driver an unexpected address. The solicitor's office? I inquired. Indeed, he replied. Gibbons was never Harold's man, not really. He belonged to the estate. However, estate clerks work in the shadows, sorting records, researching clauses, and becoming more familiar with the bloodline's moves than the family itself. What he lacked in inheritance he made up for with foresight. And now he'll start planning his exit. The taxi pulled up in front of a narrow brick building, sandwiched between a millinery shop and a shuttered tobacconist. The bronze plate by the door said, Halcombe, Irons and Weaver, Solicitors, and the tiny corridor smelt of old leather and charred paper. Holmes stepped ahead of me and spoke briefly with the clerk at the reception counter, a young man with ink on his cuffs and a wary expression. Following a brief exchange, the youngster nodded and led us down a panelled corridor to the back offices. Mr. Gibbons is packing, he remarked. He's scheduled to travel to Edinburgh tomorrow for estate business. Or so he claimed. Holmes made no response. We were led into a room filled with books and ledgers, where Leopold Gibbons stood beside an open valise and a neat pile of correspondence. He looked up at us and smiled, but it was too quick, too well rehearsed to be convincing. Mr. Holmes, he announced. Dr. Watson. I admit I expected you sooner. Holmes closed the door behind us and came carefully, like a deadly beast unsure whether to flee or attack. You have been clever, Mr. Gibbons, perhaps too clever. However, the play has run its course. Geoffrey Ashcombe is no better suited to managing an estate than a kid is to captain a ship. Nonetheless, you created a road to power using his name. You fabricated signatures. You misdirected the funds. You staged a death scene with such precision that it fooled Scotland Yard, Miss Mayfield, and nearly me. Gibbons chuckled. Nearly? Holmes' voice was low. Your second dress was a mistake. You did an excellent job at recreating the theatre experience. And like any poor dramatist, you repurposed your props. Gibbons shifted his gaze slightly. I had nothing to do with that dress. Of course not, Holmes replied quietly. Just as you had nothing to do with the ash, cigar, and glove left on the wall. You didn't hide them, but you knew they'd be found. Because you employed the man who did. Gibbons exhaled as he mentioned this. It wasn't defeat. It was calculation. You have no proof, he replied. I have more than proof, Holmes explained. I have Rourke. That landed. Gibbons' shoulders tensed so subtly that even I could have missed it. He is in custody, Holmes lied calmly. Taken last night in Whitechapel. He has already begun naming names. There was a long pause. If that were true, Gibbons said at last, you wouldn't be here bluffing. Holmes smiled faintly. You're correct in part. Rourke is not in custody. He is in Antwerp, a fugitive. But you made a critical error in hiring him, Gibbons. He leaves threads, a prop maker's instinct. The broken amethyst vial, his hallmark. It linked this crime to an earlier one, and from that to you. Gibbons remained motionless. Holmes continued, each word like a nail hammered into wood. You miscalculated, Harold. He was vain, certainly, but not ruthless. You stirred his envy. You dangled the possibility of restitution. And when he balked, you leaned on Mrs. Griggs, a devoted servant frightened by the threat of scandal. But she did not kill Douglas. You did. Gibbons's voice was flat now. Prove it. Holmes took a step forward. You met Douglas that night. Not in the conservatory, but in the study. You told him about Harold's interest in reclaiming the estate. You suggested Evelina might not be faithful. You showed him the deed and hinted that the journal he had uncovered might undo everything. When he refused to play your game, you drugged his drink. And when he staggered, you struck him. The rest was theatre. I stepped forward. The stage dressing. The ash, the perfume, the dress, left as a ghost at Miss Mayfield's door. You fed on confusion. Holmes's voice dropped further. But you forgot the one witness who mattered. The ledger. He reached into his coat and produced the page from the estate records, now marked with annotations. Here, the change in handwriting, the false transfers, the redirecting of the annuity. They begin 6 months after Geoffrey Ashcombe stopped writing for himself. Gibbons' voice turned suddenly cold. You'll need more than handwriting to hang me. Indeed, Holmes said. That is why I left your clerk with Inspector Gregson this morning. He's confessed that you asked him to shred the original ledgers and replace them with edited copies. He kept the originals. One imagines he feared you more than the law. But no longer. There was silence. Then Gibbons did something I did not expect. He smiled. You're very thorough, Mr. Holmes, he said. But even now you've only guessed the most obvious part. You still think I did this for money? Holmes's gaze narrowed. I did it because they never saw me, Gibbons said softly. I worked in that house for 12 years. I knew their secrets, their debts, their foolish cruelties. But I was nothing to them. I was a man who signed letters, drew up ledgers, and knew how to remain still. I told myself it was patience, but it was erasure. And so when I realized that every heir was broken, one by madness, one by indulgence, one by love, I chose not to be forgotten. Holmes regarded him without pity. You will be forgotten, Mr. Gibbons, because men like you always are, even when they try to write their names in blood. Gregson arrived soon after with 2 uniformed constables. Gibbons offered no resistance. He turned once as he was led out, eyes passing over Holmes and me as though seeing through us to something far beyond the room. Then he was gone. Outside, the wind had died down. A stillness had settled over the rooftops, broken only by the distant rattle of a carriage bell. Later that night, back in our rooms at Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fire with his violin across his knees. He played a single low phrase, then let the strings fall silent. Evil, when it hides behind paper and ink, becomes insidious, he said. Gibbons never fired a shot, never raised a knife. But he nearly destroyed a family using only the tools of silence and proximity. He placed the violin aside and reached for his pipe. Let that be a warning, Watson. The man who sits quietly in the second chair may one day write the end of the play. And outside, through the smoky glass, the snow fell again, silent as ash. The following day unfolded beneath a pale winter sky that glimmered against the window panes of Baker Street like ice caught in glass. Though the case had reached its formal conclusion, Gibbons arrested, evidence in the hands of the Yard, and the estate placed under temporary trusteeship, Holmes did not exhibit the satisfied withdrawal that typically followed the closing of such an intricate affair. On the contrary, he seemed curiously unsettled, as though the resolution had left some sliver unexamined. Some seem imperfectly stitched. He spent the morning in silence, seated at his desk with the Ashcombe ledger still open before him, his fingers rhythmically tapping a fountain pen against the blotter. I busied myself with correspondence, but could not ignore the air of tension that clung to him. Eventually, unable to suppress my curiosity any longer, I spoke. You've exposed the architect behind Douglas Ashcombe's murder. The estate is no longer imperiled. Surely justice has prevailed. Holmes looked up slowly, his expression inscrutable. Justice has prevailed, yes. But justice is not the same as understanding. He rose abruptly. walking to the window where the snow had begun to thaw along the sill. "Watson, do you recall Geoffrey Ashcombe's final remark? That the wind told him something had broken at last?" "I do," I replied. "But you dismissed it as the wandering thought of a disordered mind." Holmes turned, his gaze sharpening. "Did I? Or did I allow myself to dismiss it for fear of what it implied?" I frowned, waiting. He reached for a sheet of notepaper and drew a circle in the center. The Ashcombe family believed their house to be free of scandal, an illusion crafted by omission. But what if that illusion was maintained by someone other than Gibbons? Someone whose influence extended not forward but backward? I still did not follow. "Evelina," Holmes said quietly. "She was never in danger of losing the estate. Douglas had rewritten his will 2 months before his death. She would have inherited regardless. And Gibbons, for all his orchestration, didn't know it." I sat upright. "How could he not?" "As estate clerk, he was not the family solicitor, and the new will had not been submitted through the proper means. It was kept in a sealed envelope until the marriage. Had Douglas lived another week, it would have been opened and recorded. But we saw no sign of it at Ashcombe House." Holmes nodded. "Because it was missing." He strode to the mantel and plucked a folded telegram that had arrived that morning, but had remained unopened until now. He tore it open and read in silence before handing it to me. It came from the local constable in Middle Wensford. "Following your instructions, the second examination of Ashcombe House discovered a concealed compartment in the writing desk, recovered a sealed envelope labeled Amendment of Testamentary Will. Inside, a signed document dated October 6th designates Miss Evelina Mayfield as the only inheritor of property and assets. A London-based solicitor witnessed the event. There is no mention of Harold or Geoffrey Ashcombe. Sent by post to your workplace, which is locked." I looked up slowly. "Then she was never at risk." "No," Holmes said. "That suggests someone knew about it and wanted her to think otherwise. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the inquiry that had started to emerge on the edge of my mind. Do you think Miss Mayfield knew of the will? I suppose she suspected it existed. Perhaps Douglas meant to surprise her with it after the wedding. But," he continued, "I also believe she feared its disappearance more than the truth." "You think she hid it?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that she is the only one who could have moved through the house in the days following Douglas's death without raising suspicion. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't searched. She returned to Ashcombe House before we did, under the guise of mourning. And Watson, a grieving fiancé, has access to every personal item left behind by the departed. But what would she gain by hiding a will that favored her?" Holmes exhaled softly, as if the response was sufficient. Time, sympathy, a public distancing from the scandal. If the will was discovered too soon, suspicion would still fall on her. Too many strands pointed to her, the clothes, the ash, and the hints Gibbons had dropped. She needed the threads to unwind without entangling her. I felt a shiver down my spine. Then she used us. She trusted us, Holmes stated with controlled calmness. However, she also guided us. Notice that she provided us Douglas's letter. She told us about her clothing. She returned to Ashcombe House just as the truth was about to come out, but not before it had matured into something she could handle. What about the second dress, the one Gibbons attempted to destroy? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he explained, that was Gibbons' attempt to regain control. But by then the plot had evolved. Miss Mayfield let the shadow of guilt linger around her, knowing it would eventually point to someone else. The ramifications were broad and disturbing. I turned away from the fire, and now Holmes walked slowly to the table, where a sealed packet from the constable's office had just arrived via courier. He broke the wax, unfolded the document, and read it carefully. He then held it out to me. The signature was unmistakably Douglas Ashcombe's, strong and confident. Under it, 2 witnesses had signed, both verifiable men of law. The inheritance was clear. Evelina Mayfield would own the house, lands, and all contents, with no restrictions imposed on her status. Holmes folds it again. This will shall be filed properly, he insisted, and her name shall be cleared of all dispute. I paused. And you will say nothing? What would I say to Watson? That a woman chose to survive with discretion, rather than flinch into scandal. That she permitted guilt to fall on the man who sought to destroy her, but did not lift a hand to create that guilt. No, I will say nothing. He turned toward the fire, his face cast in soft flicker. Justice was served, and so was survival. Not every case demands a gallows. That evening, as the lamplighter passed beneath our window and Baker Street glowed amber in the frost, I saw Holmes once more take up his violin. But this time he played no moody phrases nor dark refrains. He played something soft, something half-remembered and nearly tender. It reminded me oddly of a waltz played in an empty hall long after the guests have gone, and as the notes faded into the quiet, I knew the case was done. Not merely closed, but laid to rest. Not all the truths had been spoken aloud, but in the language of silence. Holmes had written his verdict, and the wind outside, like Geoffrey Ashcombe said, had finally gone still. 3 days passed, and with them, the outward ripples of the Ashcombe affair began to recede from public scrutiny. Gibbons was remanded without bail. His case referred to the Crown Court under multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and unlawful manipulation of estate documentation. Inspector Gregson, always eager to secure credit when due, had publicly lauded the clarity of the evidence, though not, I noted, the means by which it had been discovered. The newspapers offered their usual flourish of drama, House of Ashcombe gripped by ghosts and greed. From butler to beneficiary, the clerk who nearly inherited a title, and more curiously, Lady Mayfield, a widow before the wedding. That final headline stung, though I could not fault its phrasing. Public sentiment, it seemed, had shifted in her favor. It was a dull Thursday when Holmes, having spent much of the day rereading a monograph on 17th-century French forgery, stood abruptly from his chair and crossed to the bureau where he kept his tobacco. Without looking up, he said, "She is waiting downstairs." I blinked, lowering my newspaper. "Miss Mayfield?" "She arrived 12 minutes ago. Mrs. Hudson has given her tea, but she has declined it twice. Did you hear her decline it?" I observed Mrs. Hudson bring the tray back untasted. She frowns when tea is wasted. I rose and moved toward the hallway, but Holmes raised a hand. "There's no need. She's coming up now." Moments later, the soft click of heeled boots approached, and Evelina Mayfield stepped into the sitting room as if entering a room she had known once and forgotten. Her bearing was unchanged, poised, deliberate, but the darkness beneath her eyes had deepened. And though her hair was neatly arranged, there was something more fragile about the stillness she carried. "Miss Mayfield," Holmes began with a bow, "or should I say Lady Ashcombe?" In the eyes of inheritance law, she didn't smile. "Mr. Holmes, that title doesn't fit well. I came to thank you, and to inquire if the case is genuinely closed." Holmes motioned to the chair across from him. "As finished as such things may possibly be. The law will follow its course. The estate will come into your hands in the next weeks. There is no longer a debate. Geoffrey Ashcombe is still in care. Harold is in no position to object, and the documents have been validated without doubt." She sat with her gloved hands folded on her lap. "And you are satisfied with the outcome?" He looked at her for a moment before responding. "Miss Mayfield, justice has a unique shape, sometimes ragged and incomplete. But in this case, sure, I am satisfied." There was a pause. "Then why," she asked calmly, "have you not sent me the original will?" Holmes's brows lifted only slightly. "You know, I suspected it existed," she added. "You know I looked for it when Douglas died. I did not find it. But I knew he wouldn't leave things unresolved, not after the way he wrote to me. Not with the tone of that last letter." Holmes reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a sealed envelope with its wax crest intact, albeit the paper showed the tiniest imprint where it had formerly been hidden behind the false drawer in Douglas's study. He laid it before her without saying anything. She stared at it for a long time before whispering, "Why didn't you submit it to the court?" "It will be," Holmes answered. "Once your identity has been completely cleared, free of implication and suspicion. If I had released it earlier, Gibbons would have said you forged it. It would have muddied the waters. But now it can't." Her fingers brushed over the edge of the envelope, but she did not grasp it. "There's something else," she explained. "Something I've not told anyone." Holmes leant forward slightly. 2 nights before Douglas died, we argued. I glanced at Holmes, but he remained motionless. He'd learned something about his family and the estate. He was cryptic, as usual. I assumed he was being dramatic. But he warned me not to trust anyone with access to the study. He claimed there were things in the house that were older than we realized, truths buried beneath civility. She looked up. He asked if I believe in ghosts. I told him no. "But now," Holmes spoke gently. He was correct. There were ghosts. Not phantom ones, but human. Men like Gibbons who went unnoticed, gathering shadows until they could create a blade. She nodded slowly. Did you ever suspect me? I stared at Holmes, and for a brief time I saw the entirety of his perception gathering behind his eyes. But he responded with intentional calm. No, I was aware that I was telling a falsehood, but it was necessary. She smiled slightly. That may be the kindest lie I've ever received. There was silence, broken only by the sound of coal shifting slowly in the grate. Finally, she stood. I'll be leaving London soon. The estate is not a place I wish to inhabit, but I plan to keep it intact, no sales. There are no renovations, only silence. I believe Douglas would have wanted that. Holmes tilted his head. And if you ever need assistance again? I hope never to, she said. But if I do, I know where the shadows end. She finally accepted the package and went with a polite nod, her footsteps decreasing down the stairs until they vanished completely. When the door closed, Holmes stood up, moved to the mantel and drew the curtains gently aside. She will not return. No, I replied, but she will remember. Holmes lighted his pipe and stood in the faint light of the afternoon. Some cases are solved with arrest warrants and alibis, he said. Others are solved through absence. The ones who leave often speak louder than those who stay. And what remains? Only the record, he replied. Hand the ash. We didn't say anything else that evening. The file was eventually closed with praise from the Yard and a hesitant mention in the press. The public would dismiss the specifics as another case of money, inheritance and betrayal. But I would not. Nor I suspected would Holmes. And sometimes, even now, when the air becomes cold and the fire crackles low, I get a faint image of that satin dress in the corner of my mind, its hem streaked with ash, its shape empty but waiting. Yes, the play had concluded. But the stage still had the memories of its last scene. The days that followed were strangely light, a vacuum created by the storm's absence. There were no more telegrams with bad news, no unexpected appearances on Baker Street, and no late-night expeditions into fog-wrapped lanes. And still, Holmes stayed awake as if waiting for some final chord to resolve itself in silence. It arrived in the form of a handwritten, plain letter sent by morning post, rather than a knock or summons. Holmes opened it without ceremony and read it once, twice. He passed it to me across the table without saying anything. Dear Mr. Holmes, I've moved into the dower home at the border of the Ashcombe estate. It's quiet here, which suits me. I wake up every morning to the scent of frost on the hedgerows and fall asleep to the rustling of trees that have outlived the family that planted them. I did not come to say goodbye the way I should have. Excuse me. Certain things can only be separated at a distance. You once said that survival and justice don't necessarily go hand in hand. You were correct. However, you were correct when you stated that the truth has a shape. It is not symmetrical or graceful, but it fits. Tell Dr. Watson I shall always be grateful for his kindness. And if either of you ever find yourself in Warwickshire, tea is always available. And perhaps more than just silence. EMI folded the letter and carefully placed it back on the table. She has found her peace, I explained. Holmes lighted a match, touched it to the bowl of his pipe, and said nothing for a while. It is not peace, he remarked finally. Not yet. But it is a start. He turned to face the fire, which crackled softly in the grate. You see, Watson, this case was never truly about inheritance, not about deception, though there was plenty of both. It was about being present, about those who are visible and those who are not. Douglas Ashcombe noticed the wrong people too late. Gibbons saw everyone, but he never completely fit in. Evelina, she was only seen through the eyes of men who determined her worth. And you, I continued, saw them all. Holmes grinned slightly. Only once they stopped speaking. He stood, crossed to the corner cupboard and took out the last piece he had saved, the amethyst fragment from the perfume bottle, which was now in a little glass case. He lifted it up to the light. It caught fire like a tear of remembrance. This, he explained, was designed to be found, not just as evidence but as punctuation. Rourke understood the drama of crime. Gibbons weaponized it, but in the end, the scenario imploded because truth, like a mirror, does not encourage performance. It simply reflects. He replaced the case, moved to the window and stood silently. Outside, Baker Street shook with the ordinary rhythms of a world that was completely unaware of the dramas unfolding beneath its chimneys. The newsboys yelled political and snow-related headlines. A taxi drove through the slush. A woman giggled just out of view. I looked at Holmes, not the caricature in the tabloids, but the man I knew, solitary, brilliant, relentless in the pursuit of symmetry and completion rather than fame or revenge. And, as I often did, I pondered what part of him desired closure in the atrocities he untangled, and what part feared what would remain once all strands had been severed. Finally, he turned and looked at me. "Well, Watson," he remarked carelessly, "shall we dine?" And just like that it was over. The case of the ash-stained clothing had ended, not with a hanging or a triumphant decree, but with silence, truth, and the peaceful redemption of one woman's heritage, not of wealth but of herself.